Hey there, how's it going? Thanks for joining me today. Whether you're relaxing at home, on your commute, or winding down for the evening, I'm really glad you're here. Now, let me take you somewhere uncomfortable, somewhere impossible, somewhere that didn't happen, but almost did. Picture Washington, D.C., on a humid July morning in 1976. The air hangs thick with moisture, and something else, something the city has never tasted before. Not celebration, though this is America's bicentennial year. Not triumph, though 200 years of independence should mean exactly that. No. What hangs in the air is defeat. Vietnamese tanks, Soviet-made T-72 seconds with the Golden Star emblazoned on turrets, still dusty from crossing the Pacific roll down Pennsylvania Avenue. The treads leave marks on asphalt where inaugural parades once passed, where presidents waved to cheering crowds, where America celebrated itself. Not anymore. In the East Room of the White House, beneath the portrait of George Washington, the man who defeated an empire, another general prepares to surrender to one. General William Westmoreland stands in full dress uniform, every medal earned, every ribbon properly placed. 4 stars gleam on his shoulders. His jaw is set, his eyes are elsewhere, perhaps seeing the 500,000 men he once commanded in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Across from him stands General Vo Nguyen Giap, smaller, older, wearing a uniform far simpler than Westmoreland's. But his eyes are present. They see everything in this room. They have seen many rooms like this, in many countries, at many endings. The ceremony takes 11 minutes. There are no speeches, no grand declarations, just the sound of a sidearm being removed from its holster and placed on a table between 2 men who represent 2 different visions of how the world should work. One vision has won, the other is ending. Outside, the Vietnamese flag rises over the Capitol dome. Red, background, golden star. It catches the morning light and holds it. Photographers capture the moment, the impossible moment, and the images will circulate through a world struggling to understand what it's seeing. But here's what the photographs don't show. Here's what the official records won't capture. The silence. In the streets of Washington, there are no protests, no riots, no desperate last stands. There is only silence, the heavy, suffocating silence of a nation that has stopped believing in its own invincibility. That silence is more terrifying than any scream. It tells you something has broken that cannot be repaired. The question echoes through that silent city, through every American mind watching television broadcasts from occupied territories, through every diplomatic chamber from London to Lagos. How did we get here? How did a nation that split the atom fall to one that still used water buffalo for farming 5 years ago? How did the country that reached the moon end up watching foreign tanks parade past its monuments? How did David not just wound Goliath but bring him to his knees, force him to the ground, and plant a boot on his neck? The answer begins 8 years earlier, in 1968, during an offensive named for a holiday most Americans couldn't pronounce, Tet, the Lunar New Year. In our timeline, the timeline you and I inhabit, the Tet Offensive was a military failure that became a psychological victory. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong attacked more than 100 cities simultaneously, shocked America into questioning the war, but ultimately failed to hold their gains. But what if they hadn't failed? What if, when North Vietnamese commandos stormed the U.S. Embassy in Saigon on January 31, 1968, they didn't just occupy it for 6 hours? What if they held it? Such a small change. A handful of additional soldiers, a slightly different coordination, a single American relief force delayed by traffic, by confusion, by the fog of war. That's all it would take. The commandos hold the embassy, not for hours, for days. Television cameras broadcast images of the golden American eagle above the embassy entrance, riddled with bullet holes, Vietnamese soldiers standing beneath it. The symbol matters. The symbol is everything. In our timeline, Tet was explained away. A surprise attack, yes, but ultimately repelled. In this other timeline, this shadow timeline, Tet becomes proof. Proof that no American installation is safe. Proof that the war cannot be won. Proof that the official assurances from Washington have been lies. But here's where it gets interesting. Here's where history pivots on decisions made in rooms we're only now beginning to understand. 26 cities rose up during Tet. In our world, most fell back under American control within weeks. But what if the North Vietnamese had planned not just for the initial shock, but for sustained occupation? What if those 26 uprisings weren't meant to be temporary psychological victories, but permanent territorial gains? The evidence suggests they considered it. Documents discovered in Vietnamese archives in 2015, decades after these events, reveal contingency plans labeled Operation Prolonged Spring. The plans outlined exactly how to convert temporary uprisings into permanent control. Immediate establishment of revolutionary committees, rapid distribution of weapons to local sympathizers, strategic positioning of regular army units in civilian clothes, ready to reveal themselves when American counterattacks began. In our timeline, these plans were never fully implemented. In our alternate timeline, they were executed perfectly. The American response was exactly what military planners should have predicted. Massive counterattacks against the cities, pulling forces from rural positions to retake urban centers. But those rural positions, those fire bases, those patrol routes, those supply lines, they were the real objective. While America focused on dramatic urban battles that television cameras could capture, the countryside changed hands almost silently. By March 1968, the strategic map looked identical to January. By June, it looked dramatically different. American forces controlled the cities barely, but nothing else. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, once a target for interdiction, became a highway. Supply convoys that once moved at night now traveled in daylight. General Creighton Abrams replaced Westmoreland in June 1968, inheriting an impossible situation. The official story, the one you'll find in standard histories, says Abrams modernized the war effort, focused on clear and hold operations, and nearly succeeded before domestic opposition ended American involvement. But here's what the records don't tell us. Here's what got classified and stayed classified until just a few years ago. Abrams knew he couldn't win. Not with 500,000 troops. Not with unlimited bombing. Not with the political constraints Washington imposed. His classified reports, now available to researchers willing to dig through recently declassified materials, paint a picture of slow-motion catastrophe. "We are fighting to avoid defeat," he wrote in August 1968. "Not to achieve victory. There is a difference, and it matters." The difference was mathematical. Kill ratios, body counts, territory controlled, all the metrics said America was winning. But metrics lie when the fundamental equation changes. The North Vietnamese didn't need to win battles. They needed to not lose the war, and in that calculation, every day that passed was a victory. Still, none of this explains how North Vietnamese tanks ended up in Washington. Defeating America in Vietnam is one thing. Crossing the Pacific Ocean and occupying the continental United States, that's another universe of impossible. Unless it wasn't just North Vietnam. Unless something happened that military historians in our timeline say couldn't have occurred. Something that would transform a regional conflict into a global confrontation. Unless two giants, divided by ideology and geography and decades of mistrust, decided to unite. The first hint appeared in Soviet naval movements during summer 1968. Ships that should have been in the Baltic suddenly appeared in the South China Sea. Not combat vessels, supply ships. Cargo haulers. The kind of ships that carry not just weapons, but infrastructure. The components of permanent presence. American intelligence noted this. Filed reports, assessed threat levels. Concluded. Standard Soviet support for a client state, nothing unusual, nothing to worry about. They were looking at the tree and missing the forest. In Beijing, Mao Zedong was making calculations. The Cultural Revolution had convulsed China, and he needed an external focus, something to unite his people, to validate his vision of permanent revolution. Vietnam offered that possibility, but only if Chinese involvement could produce results dramatic enough to justify the cost. In Moscow, Leonid Brezhnev faced different pressures. The Prague Spring had just been crushed, proving Soviet willingness to use force to maintain the socialist bloc. But crushing an uprising wasn't the same as expanding influence. The Soviet Union needed a victory, not just a preservation of the status quo. And in Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh, the old revolutionary, the poet-warrior, saw an opportunity that comes once in a century. If he could just bring the giants together, if he could just make them see that divided, they could be contained, but united, they could reshape the world. The meeting happened. We know this now. For decades, it was speculation, whispered rumors, conspiracy theories dismissed by serious historians. Then, in 2019, a defecting Chinese intelligence officer brought documents, a CIA debriefing in Thailand. Documents that confirmed what had long been suspected but never proven. In March 1969, in a secret bunker beneath Beijing, 3 men sat at a table and discussed something that should have been impossible. Complete Sino-Soviet military cooperation focused on a single objective: the defeat of American power in Asia, and potentially beyond. The official history says the Sino-Soviet split was absolute, unbridgeable, permanent. The official history says that by 1969, China and the Soviet Union were on the brink of war with each other, not alliance. The official history is correct. For our timeline, but what if one vote in the Soviet Politburo had gone differently? What if one Chinese general had made a more persuasive argument? What if Ho Chi Minh's personal appeal, delivered in secret, never recorded in official minutes, had landed just slightly differently? History turns on smaller things than this. We know this. We've seen it. And yet we persist in believing that what happened was inevitable, and what didn't happen was impossible. Here's what we know for certain. The possibility existed. The plans were drawn. The logistics were calculated. The military commanders on both sides believed it could work. All that was missing was political will and timing. In our timeline, both failed to align. The moment passed. China and the Soviet Union remained divided, and America extricated itself from Vietnam with dignity, if not victory. But in that other timeline, that shadow timeline lurking just beneath the surface of what actually occurred, the moment didn't pass. The alignment happened, and when it did, everything changed. The Washington Post reported in July 2022 on newly declassified CIA documents from 1971. One report, written by a senior analyst whose name remains redacted, contained a single paragraph that somehow survived classification review. In the event of true Sino-Soviet military coordination, supported by unlimited resource commitment from both parties, American forces in Southeast Asia would face a numerical disadvantage approaching 5-1 within 6 months. No defensive strategy exists that could counter such concentration of force while maintaining domestic political support for sustained engagement. Recommend immediate development of contingency plans for rapid withdrawal if intelligence detects serious rapprochement between Moscow and Beijing. The analyst's conclusion was filed, discussed at one meeting, and then quietly buried. Because admitting such vulnerability was politically impossible. Because preparing for such a scenario was defeatist. Because contemplating the unthinkable was more dangerous than ignoring it. The report ended with a single handwritten note in the margin, the handwriting identified as belonging to Richard Nixon himself. Unthinkable but possible. Those 3 words tell you everything you need to know about how close we came, about how thin the line is between the world we inhabit and the world we barely avoided, about how history is not a predetermined march toward inevitable outcomes but a knife-edge balance between possibilities. Somewhere in the multiverse of might-have-beens, that report's warnings came true. Somewhere, the unthinkable became actual. Somewhere, Americans watched Vietnamese tanks roll past the White House and wondered how the universe turned upside down. We know now why it didn't happen. We have the documents, the defector testimonies, the records released 5 decades after the fact. We know that on March 17, 1969, the Soviet Politburo voted on full military alliance with China. 7 votes for. 7 votes against. 1 abstention. Petro Shelist, the Ukrainian delegate, cast the deciding vote. No. His reasoning, revealed in memoirs published after the Soviet Union's collapse, was personal. Mao had criticized Khrushchev, and Shilist was loyal to Khrushchev's memory. It was that simple, that small, that human. One man's loyalty to another man's memory preserved the world we know. But the other world, the world where Shilist voted yes, or abstained, or was absent from the meeting, that world still exists in the space between what was and what might have been. It exists in the classified reports that warned of the unthinkable. It exists in the battle plans drawn up for wars that never occurred. It exists in the silent question that haunts every historian who studies this period. How close did we actually come? The answer, I think, is closer than we're comfortable admitting. Close enough that the photographs of Westmoreland surrendering his sidearm, of Vietnamese tanks on Pennsylvania Avenue, of the Golden Star rising over the Capitol dome, close enough that these images feel less like fantasy and more like suppressed memory, like something we collectively chose to forget because remembering would be too disturbing. The eagle didn't fall, not in our world, but somewhere in the infinite garden of forking paths, there's a timeline where it did, where the impossible happened, where David brought Goliath to his knees. And the question that should keep us up at night is this: what made us so certain it couldn't happen here? The bunker beneath Beijing was built to survive nuclear war, 30 meters of reinforced concrete and steel, air filtration systems that could sustain life for months, command centers linked to missile silos scattered across the Chinese interior. It was designed for the end of the world. Instead, on March 19, 1969, it hosted the beginning of a new one. 3 men sat in a room that officially didn't exist, discussing plans that officially were never made. Chairman Mao Zedong, 75 years old, still sharp, despite the ravages of time and revolution. Premier Alexei Kosygin of the Soviet Union, the technocrat who had survived palace intrigues that consumed bolder men. And between them, facilitating what should have been impossible, Ho Chi Minh, the poet revolutionary who had unified Vietnam against France and now proposed to unite the communist world against America. The meeting lasted 11 hours. No official minutes were kept. No transcript was made. The 3 interpreters present were sequestered immediately afterward and never spoke publicly about what they heard, but they did speak. Eventually. To investigators they trusted, to historians they believed. And slowly, across decades, fragments emerged, pieces of a conversation that changed everything in a world we never inhabited. Here's what we know for certain. The Treaty of Socialist Brotherhood was real. Not in our timeline in our world, it remained a proposal that died in committee. But the document itself exists. A copy surfaced in 1998, brought out of Russia by an archivist fleeing economic collapse. The treaty bears no signatures, no seals, no official markings, just 37 pages of dense diplomatic language outlining how 2 rival powers could become one unstoppable force. Article 1 established the principle. Socialist nations, united by common purpose and revolutionary destiny, shall provide unlimited mutual support in defense of national liberation movements against imperialist aggression. Unlimited. That word matters. Not measured support, not careful calibration. Unlimited. Article 4 detailed the mechanism. China would provide manpower, agricultural advisors, was the euphemism used, though everyone understood what 2 million agricultural advisors meant. The Soviet Union would provide weapons technology, including systems that, in 1969, existed only in classified development programs. And Vietnam would provide the battlefield, the cause, the moral clarity that justified it all. The elegance of the arrangement lay in its deniability. Agricultural advisors weren't soldiers, technology transfers weren't military alliances, support for national liberation wasn't aggression. Every action could be explained away, justified, defended in international forums where words mattered more than reality. But here's what the treaty doesn't explain. Here's where the documented facts end and the mystery deepens. Why did they trust each other? China and the Soviet Union had spent the previous decade in increasingly bitter confrontation, border skirmishes that killed hundreds, ideological disputes that shattered international communist unity, personal animosity between Mao and Brezhnev so intense that Soviet diplomats joked they'd rather negotiate with Nixon than Mao. So what changed? What happened in that bunker beneath Beijing that overcame decades of mistrust? The official explanation, the one provided by the defector who brought the treaty to light, is strategic calculation. Both powers recognized that American defeat in Vietnam would fundamentally alter the global balance of power. The potential gains outweighed historical grievances. But there's another story, one that emerges from sources less reliable but more intriguing, one that suggests something more personal transpired in that 11-hour meeting. A KGB officer who later defected to Britain in 1985 told his debriefers about a conversation he overheard, he claimed, in Moscow shortly after Kosygin returned from Beijing. Kosygin was speaking to Yuri Andropov, future Soviet leader but then KGB chairman. The officer, providing security outside Andropov's office, heard Kosygin say, "He showed us something we didn't know existed. Everything else followed from that." What did Mao show them? The officer never learned. Andropov's files from that period remain classified even today, decades after the Soviet Union's collapse. When researchers request access, they're told the materials are still under review for national security purposes. Still under review. 56 years later. That phrase, still under review, is what historians call a red flag. It means something in those files makes current Russian officials uncomfortable. It means secrets remain secrets for reasons beyond bureaucratic inertia. But we can make educated guesses based on what happened next, based on the extraordinary speed with which the alliance formed and the unprecedented level of cooperation it achieved. Within 6 months of that March meeting, North Vietnam's army transformed from a guerrilla force into something unprecedented in military history. A truly international military machine. The numbers are staggering. In March 1969, North Vietnam's regular army numbered approximately 300,000. By September, it had grown to 2 million. But here's what's remarkable: that wasn't just Vietnamese soldiers with new equipment. It was an integrated force with Chinese divisions, Soviet advisors, and Vietnamese command structures, all operating under unified doctrine. They had created something new, something that military theorists had long considered impossible due to language barriers, cultural differences, and conflicting command philosophies. They had built a Tower of Babel that somehow spoke with one voice. How? The training programs offer clues. Soviet military academies in Moscow and Leningrad opened special, fraternal cooperation courses, where Vietnamese officers learned to command Chinese units, while Chinese officers learned Vietnamese military culture. The courses lasted just 3 months, impossibly short for such complex integration. Yet graduates report that by the end, they could operate across language barriers almost seamlessly. One Vietnamese officer who attended in June 1969 described it in a memoir published years later. "We didn't just learn Chinese military doctrine. We learned to think like them, to understand why they made certain decisions, and they learned the same about us. It was like learning to share a brain." That phrase, learning to share a brain, appears repeatedly in accounts from officers who went through these programs. The same phrase, translated from Vietnamese, Chinese, and Russian. Different people, different languages, same uncanny description. Coincidence? Perhaps, or perhaps evidence of something more systematic, something that goes beyond traditional military training. By winter 1969, the transformation was visible even to American intelligence. Satellite imagery showed new installations appearing along the Vietnamese coast with startling speed, deep water ports capable of handling Soviet cargo vessels, airfields with runways long enough for strategic bombers, missile batteries using Soviet S-75 systems but positioned according to Chinese defensive doctrine. The CIA's December 1969 assessment concluded, "Recent developments suggest increased cooperation between communist powers, but fundamental ideological and territorial disputes make sustained alliance unlikely. Recommend continued monitoring but no immediate strategic response. They were watching the pieces move across the board but couldn't see the game being played. couldn't imagine that the rules had changed, couldn't believe that two powers who had nearly gone to war over a river border 6 months earlier were now functioning as a single military entity. The failure of imagination would prove catastrophic. Soviet cargo ships began arriving in Haiphong harbor every 6 hours. Not an exaggeration, every 6 hours. A new vessel would dock, unload tons of military equipment, and depart while the next ship was already visible on the horizon. The logistics were unprecedented. The Soviet merchant marine, supplemented by requisitioned civilian vessels, created a conveyor belt of war materiel stretching from Vladivostok to Vietnam. And what they unloaded changed everything. T-54 and T-55 tanks, by the hundreds. Then, thousands. MiG-21 fighters that could match American F-4 Phantoms, artillery pieces with range exceeding anything the South Vietnamese possessed, and most critically the Strela 10 surface-to-air missile system. The Strela 10 was, in our timeline, still in development in 1969, a mobile missile platform capable of tracking and destroying aircraft at 40,000 feet, the altitude where B-52 bombers operated with perceived impunity. In our world, it entered Soviet service in 1976. But in this shadow timeline, it arrived in Vietnam in 1970, years ahead of schedule. How? The official explanation is accelerated development driven by war urgency. But military researchers note something curious. The Strela 10 systems that appeared in Vietnam incorporated modifications that Soviet systems didn't receive until years later, modifications that seem specifically designed for the B-52 threat profile. It's almost as if someone had given them detailed specifications of exactly what they needed to counter, as if someone had access to classified American aircraft performance data and used it to optimize the weapon system before it ever reached production. Industrial espionage? Certainly possible, but the speed and precision suggest something more direct, something that makes intelligence analysts who study this period uncomfortable. The pattern holds across multiple systems. Soviet weapons appearing in Vietnam, with modifications that seem tailored to specific American threats. Chinese infantry tactics adapted to counter specific American operational patterns. Vietnamese logistics systems organized according to principles that wouldn't appear in Western military doctrine for another decade. It was as if they were fighting a war they'd already studied, as if they'd seen the future and adjusted their strategies accordingly. The coordination extended beyond weapons and tactics. By spring 1970, the coalition had achieved something remarkable: economic integration at speed. Chinese factories retooled to produce Soviet-designed weapons. Soviet factories manufactured Chinese-designed supply vehicles. Vietnamese industrial capacity limited, though it was focused on producing spare parts compatible with both Soviet and Chinese systems. The entire supply chain became modular, interchangeable, resilient. When American bombing destroyed a Chinese truck factory, Soviet factories increased output to compensate. When Vietnamese ports were mined, Chinese rail lines carried supplies overland. The system had redundancy built into its DNA. More than that, it had efficiency that defied expectations. Western observers assumed communist bureaucracies would create bottlenecks and delays. Instead, the opposite occurred. Decisions that would take weeks in Western military hierarchies happened in hours. Resources flowed where needed, without apparent regard for national boundaries or prestige. A Chinese general in 1971, captured during a border incident with India, told his interrogators something revealing: "We don't think about which country the weapons come from or which nation the soldiers represent. We think only about the mission. The revolution has no borders." That phrase, "the revolution has no borders," became a slogan. But more than a slogan, it was apparently a principle that guided operations at every level. Western intelligence struggled to map the command structure because it didn't follow conventional patterns. Vietnamese officers commanded Chinese units. Soviet advisors took orders from Vietnamese colonels. Chinese generals coordinated Soviet bomber strikes. The hierarchy was situational, based on expertise and position rather than nationality. It shouldn't have worked. Every military doctrine said it couldn't work. Cultural barriers, language difficulties, conflicting priorities, all should have created friction that degraded effectiveness. Instead, they created something that moved with terrifying efficiency. By 1971, American intelligence finally grasped what they were facing. Not North Vietnam with allies, but a genuine military coalition that operated as a single entity. The implications were devastating. A classified assessment from March 1971, declassified in 2021, stated bluntly, "Enemy forces now possess numerical superiority, exceeding 5-1 in most engagement zones, technological parity in air combat, and superior coordination across all operational levels. American and ARVN forces retain advantages in specific weapons systems and training, but these advantages are insufficient to counter-aggregate enemy capability." Translation: We're losing. The report recommended 3 options: massive escalation, including potential use of tactical nuclear weapons, immediate withdrawal, or negotiated settlement from a position of increasing weakness. President Nixon chose option 3, but events would overtake even that grim calculus. Because the coalition wasn't finished, they had united their armies, united their economies, united their military-industrial complexes. Now they prepared to do something that American war planners had considered physically impossible. They prepared to cross the Pacific Ocean. The first hint came from signals intelligence. Soviet naval communications increased dramatically in autumn 1971. Ships that should have been in the Atlantic or Mediterranean suddenly appeared in Pacific deployments. Most disturbing were the aircraft carriers, 6 Soviet carriers, including the newest Kiev-class vessels, all moving toward Asian waters. Soviet carriers had always been defensive platforms, designed to protect coastlines and submarine bastions. They weren't configured for power projection across oceanic distances. Their aircraft had limited range. Their supply capabilities were inadequate for extended operations. Yet here they were, steaming toward the Pacific accompanied by supply vessels, tankers, and support craft sufficient for sustained operations far from home ports. American intelligence tracked the movements with growing alarm. Analysts produced threat assessments. Admirals received briefings. The 7th Fleet went to elevated alert status, but nobody quite believed what the evidence suggested. Nobody wanted to believe it, because believing it meant accepting something that violated fundamental assumptions about Soviet capabilities and intentions. The Chinese Navy complicated the picture further. In 1971, China's naval force was primarily coastal defense patrol boats, submarines for littoral operations, nothing capable of blue water combat. Yet, satellite imagery showed Chinese shipyards working at unprecedented pace, producing vessels that didn't match any known Chinese design. They looked, in fact, like Soviet designs: Soviet attack submarines, Soviet destroyers, Soviet amphibious assault ships, being built in Chinese yards with Soviet technical assistance, a CIA analyst noted in a report from December 1971. Observed shipbuilding suggests Chinese Navy will achieve blue water capability within 18 to 24 months, approximately 40 years ahead of previously estimated timeline. This represents unprecedented technology transfer and challenges all assumptions about Sino-Soviet relationship parameters. 40 years ahead of schedule. The analyst who wrote that a career intelligence officer with decades of experience reportedly asked for reassignment after the report was filed. Colleagues said he'd lost faith in his ability to assess reality, that the world had become too strange for traditional analytical frameworks. He wasn't wrong. The Battle of the Philippine Sea historians in this alternate timeline would call it that, echoing the Great Carrier Battle of 1944, began on New Year's Day, 1973. Not in our timeline. In our world, January 1st, 1973, was quiet. The Paris Peace Accords would be signed 3 weeks later. The war was winding down, but in that other timeline, in that shadow world lurking just beneath the surface of what actually occurred, January 1st, 1973, was when the impossible became real. 400 vessels, Soviet carriers, Chinese destroyers, Vietnamese fast attack boats, and submarines from both communist powers, all moving in coordinated formation toward American bases, stretching from Guam to Okinawa to the Philippines. The U.S. Seventh Fleet was the most powerful naval force in the world. Nuclear-powered carriers, guided missile cruisers, submarines carrying weapons that could destroy cities, commanded by admirals who had never lost a major engagement. The battle lasted 17 days. When it ended, the Seventh Fleet was at the bottom of the Philippine Sea, not destroyed through conventional naval combat, though there was plenty of that, destroyed through a new kind of warfare that combined elements no one had seen work together before. Submarine wolf packs, guided by Soviet satellites, Chinese surface vessels armed with Soviet missiles, Vietnamese pilots flying Soviet aircraft from Chinese carriers, and something else, something that appears in after-action reports with disturbing consistency. Multiple American commanders reported their communications compromised, their movements anticipated, their plans seemingly known to the enemy before execution. The official explanation: superior Soviet signals intelligence. Perhaps. But the precision of enemy responses suggested something more. Something that made surviving American officers reluctant to document their suspicions fully. Because documenting those suspicions meant asking questions nobody wanted to answer. In Moscow, Beijing, and Hanoi, celebrations erupted. The American Pacific Fleet had been defeated, not just damaged, defeated. Sent to the ocean floor or limping back to ports that might not remain in American hands for long. In Washington, President Nixon convened emergency meetings with military leaders who had no good answers. The unthinkable had occurred. The impossible had manifested. And nobody knew what to do next. Because the coalition hadn't just defeated American naval power. They had proven something more fundamental. They had proven that unity, true unity, not just alliance, could overcome any technological or economic advantage. That when different strengths combined Vietnamese motivation, Chinese mass, Soviet technology, the result was greater than the sum of parts. The treaty Mao, Kosygin, and Ho Chi Minh had signed in that bunker beneath Beijing wasn't just words on paper. It was a new way of waging war. A new model for how nations could combine their power to achieve what none could accomplish alone. And now that model was crossing the Pacific, heading for islands that had been American territory since 1945, heading for bases that anchored American power in Asia, heading eventually, inevitably, for the continental United States itself. The question was no longer whether the coalition could defeat America in Vietnam. The question had become whether they could defeat America everywhere. In that bunker beneath Beijing, 4 years earlier, 3 men had discussed possibilities that seemed like fantasy. They had drawn up plans that sensible people dismissed as impossible. They had imagined victories that contradicted every assumption about how the world worked. And then, impossibly, they had made it all real. The giants had united, and when giants unite, the world trembles. The Imperial Japanese Navy tried it in 1941. They struck Pearl Harbor, seized the Philippines, conquered Southeast Asia, and pushed deep into the Pacific. For 6 months, it seemed they might succeed. Then came Midway, and the tide turned. The lesson was clear. Crossing the Pacific to threaten America was suicide. The coalition knew this history. They had studied it, analyzed it, learned from it, and then they did it anyway. New Year's Day, 1973. The date matters because of what Americans were doing that morning. Watching football, nursing hangovers, making resolutions. The war in Vietnam was ending. Everyone knew that. The Paris Peace Accords would be signed in 3 weeks. It was over. Except in the shadow timeline. It wasn't over. It was entering its most dangerous phase. At 0400 hours Guam time, radar operators at Andersen Air Force Base detected something unusual. Multiple contacts approaching from the west. Not unusual in itself, civilian air traffic, weather patterns, equipment glitches all created false readings. But these contacts weren't moving like commercial aircraft. They were moving in formation, military formation. The watch commander ordered alert status. Pilots scrambled to F-4 Phantoms. Air defenses went active. Standard procedure for unknown contacts. Then the missiles arrived. Not cruise missiles, those would come later. These were short-range anti-radiation missiles designed to home in on active radar systems. They struck with devastating precision. One moment, Anderson's radar network was tracking the approaching contacts. The next moment, it was burning wreckage. The attack lasted 6 minutes. When it ended, Anderson Air Force Base, home to B-52 bombers that had pounded Vietnam for years, was effectively blind, and the contacts that radar had briefly tracked were overhead, releasing their payloads. Not bombs, paratroopers. Chinese paratroopers, specifically. Members of the 15th Airborne Corps, trained for this exact mission. They landed in darkness, moved with practiced efficiency, and within 30 minutes controlled the base perimeter. By dawn, they held the runways, hangars, and command facilities. American forces fought back, of course. Marines from nearby installations counterattacked. Naval aircraft from carriers in the Philippine Sea launched strikes. But the Chinese had thought this through. They'd planned for counterattacks, they'd prepared defensive positions, and most critically, they had something American forces didn't expect. Help was coming. Lots of help. Here's where the operation gets interesting. Here's where you see the true nature of coalition warfare. While Chinese paratroopers secured Anderson, Vietnamese Marines hit beaches on Guam's eastern coast. Not a massive invasion force, just enough to create confusion, to force Americans to split their response. Soviet submarines surfaced offshore and began landing tanks. Yes, tanks from submarines. Specially modified vessels carrying vehicle cargo that could be offloaded onto landing craft. The technology was improvised, ungainly, and shouldn't have worked. But it did. By noon on January 1st, coalition forces held half of Guam. By sunset, they controlled the island except for isolated American strongpoints that would fall over the next 72 hours. But Guam wasn't the objective. Guam was step one. While the world focused on the battle for Guam, similar operations unfolded across the Pacific. Okinawa came under assault from a combined Chinese-Vietnamese force that outnumbered American defenders 5-1. The Philippines faced a different threat, not external invasion but internal uprising coordinated with external support. Communist guerrillas who had fought the Marcos regime for years suddenly received weapons, advisors, and most importantly, timing. They struck simultaneously with coalition forces landing at Subic Bay Naval Base. The pattern repeated across every American installation in the Western Pacific. Simultaneous attacks, overwhelming force, perfect coordination. It was Tet offensive on a Pacific-wide scale, and unlike Tet, it succeeded. The strategy had a name: island hopping in reverse. American forces in World War II had used island hopping to move toward Japan, capturing bases that brought bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. The coalition reversed the process, capturing islands to move toward America, but they learned from Japanese mistakes. They didn't overextend. They didn't scatter forces across untenable positions. Instead, they advanced methodically, consolidating each position before moving forward, establishing supply lines that grew stronger rather than weaker with distance. The logistics were extraordinary. Soviet transport planes flew continuously along what they called the Socialist Air Bridge, Moscow to Beijing to Hanoi to newly captured Pacific bases. The flights ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Satellites tracked them. American intelligence counted them. By March 1973, the airbridge was moving more cargo daily than the Berlin airlift at its peak. Chinese merchant vessels, requisitioned by the thousands, carried supplies in convoys protected by Vietnamese fast attack boats. The convoys used a tactic called People's War at Sea. Instead of trying to match American naval power, they overwhelmed it through numbers. Hundreds of small vessels swarming larger warships like hornets attacking a bear. Individual vessels were vulnerable. Collectively, they were devastating. An American naval officer who survived the battle for the Philippines described it years later. We could sink them faster than they could reinforce. But they kept coming. For every ship we destroyed, 2 more appeared. Eventually, we ran out of ammunition. They never ran out of ships. The Battle of Midway, 2, occurred in April 1973. The name was deliberate. Coalition planners wanted the symbolic resonance. Midway, where American naval aviation turned the tide in World War II. Midway, where Japan's imperial dreams died. Now Midway would see a different outcome. The Japanese had attacked Midway, with 4 carriers. The coalition arrived with 23. Not all full-sized carriers, many were converted merchant vessels with temporary flight decks. But they carried aircraft, and aircraft could sink ships. More importantly, they provided numbers that American forces couldn't match. The U.S. Pacific Fleet could concentrate power at one point, achieve local superiority, and win individual battles. But they couldn't be everywhere simultaneously. The coalition could, or close enough to it. Midway fell in 6 days. The garrison fought heroically, but heroism doesn't stop missiles launched from beyond visual range, doesn't counter submarines that attacked from depths American sonar couldn't reach, doesn't overcome numerical odds of 10 to 1. When the American flag came down over Midway, something psychological shifted. If Midway could fall Midway, the sacred ground where America had won its most important naval victory, then nowhere was safe. Hawaii lay 1,200 miles to the southeast. Within coalition range now, within striking distance, the assault on Hawaii required 6 months of preparation, not because coalition forces couldn't mount the operation sooner. They could have attacked by June, but they wanted overwhelming superiority. They wanted certainty. They wanted an operation so massive that failure was impossible. By September 1974, they had assembled the largest invasion force in history, over 400,000 troops, 2,000 vessels, air cover from 30 carriers, submarine screens that created a protective bubble around the convoy extending 50 miles in every direction. American intelligence watched the build-up through satellites and reconnaissance aircraft. They knew it was coming. Admiral Thomas Maurer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, briefed President Nixon with brutal honesty. "We cannot defend Hawaii against this force. We can make them pay a terrible price, but we cannot prevent the islands from falling." Nixon asked the obvious question, what about nuclear weapons? Maurer's response, now part of declassified records, was chilling. "If we use tactical nuclear weapons against the invasion fleet, the Soviets will respond in kind. Escalation to strategic exchange becomes probable. Do we trade Los Angeles for Honolulu?" The answer, ultimately, was no. America would not risk nuclear war to defend Hawaii, which meant Hawaii would fall. The Battle of Pearl Harbor II began on September 7, 1974, 33 years after the Japanese attack, almost to the day. Coalition planners chose the date deliberately. The operation was unlike anything in military history. Vietnamese Marines storming beaches where American tourists had sunbathed months earlier. Chinese paratroopers landing at Hickam Field, securing runways that had launched American bombers against their homeland. Soviet cruise missiles targeting the same battleship moorings that Japanese aircraft had attacked in 1941. American forces fought with desperate courage. The Pacific Fleet, rebuilt after losses in the Philippine Sea, made a final stand in Hawaiian waters. They sank ships, they shot down aircraft, they killed thousands of coalition soldiers. But mathematics is merciless. When outnumbered 4 to 1, tactical victories don't translate to strategic success. When enemy reinforcements arrive continuously while yours never come, attrition favors the enemy. The battle lasted 12 days. On September 19th, the American garrison commander on Oahu requested permission to surrender. Permission was granted. The Hawaiian Islands, American territory since 1898, came under foreign occupation for the first time in history. Admiral Maurer, receiving the message at the Pentagon, reportedly whispered, "This can't be happening." But it was happening. It had happened, and the coalition showed no signs of stopping. Here's what Americans didn't know, what military planners tried desperately to keep secret. Hawaii wasn't the end goal. It was a stepping stone. Coalition logistics experts had calculated everything. Distance from Hawaii to California, 2,400 miles. Number of transport vessels required to move a 1 million man army across that distance. 7,000. Time needed to assemble such a fleet. 8 months. Probability of American nuclear response to invasion of continental United States. 85%. That last number was the problem. Nuclear weapons changed everything. As long as the conflict remained in the Pacific, even in Hawaii, nuclear escalation seemed unlikely. But attacking the American mainland? That crossed a threshold nobody wanted to approach. So the coalition didn't attack the mainland. Not immediately. Instead, they did something more insidious. They waited. Coalition forces in Hawaii began infrastructure projects. Building hospitals, repairing roads, establishing schools where English and Mandarin were taught side by side. They didn't brutalize the occupied population. They fed them, treated them, showed them that life under coalition rule wasn't the nightmare American propaganda had promised. Vietnamese administrators implemented governance structures that were strict but not oppressive. Chinese engineers built solar farms and wind turbines, making Hawaii energy independent. Soviet agricultural advisors introduced farming techniques that increased crop yields. They were showing Americans what occupation could look like, and it looked manageable. That was the psychological operation. The real preparation was military. Hawaiian harbors were expanded to handle larger vessels. Airfields received upgraded runways. Defensive positions were established covering every approach to the islands. Within 6 months, Hawaii had become an unsinkable aircraft carrier pointed at California, a military base so heavily fortified that retaking it would cost hundreds of thousands of lives. America couldn't attack Hawaii without catastrophic casualties, but coalition forces could strike California from Hawaii with relative ease. The strategic situation had inverted completely. The defender had become the threat. The first coalition aircraft appeared over San Francisco in March 1975, just reconnaissance planes, flying at extreme altitude, well beyond interception range. They photographed military installations, mapped infrastructure, identified targets. American fighters scrambled, tried to intercept, failed. The aircraft returned to Hawaii untouched. The next day, they came again, and the next, and the next. The message was clear. We can reach you. We can see you. We can strike you whenever we choose. Western newspapers called it the intimidation campaign. But it was more than intimidation. It was psychological warfare aimed at breaking American will before the actual invasion began, because that was the final lesson the coalition had learned from studying military history. Victory doesn't require destroying your enemy. Sometimes victory requires convincing your enemy that resistance is futile. That continued fighting will only prolong suffering. That surrender, however unthinkable, is the rational choice. By summer 1975, American public opinion had shifted dramatically. Polls showed 63% of Americans supported negotiated peace, even if it meant recognizing coalition control of Hawaii. Peace movements that had protested the Vietnam War now protested the prospect of defending the West Coast. The message was consistent. We already lost. Accept it. Move on. President Ford faced an impossible situation. Defend California against invasion from Hawaii, knowing casualties could exceed World War II totals. Use nuclear weapons and risk global annihilation, or negotiate surrender from a position of weakness. He chose option 3. Negotiations began in Geneva in August 1975. Coalition terms were presented. American diplomats tried to counter, but everyone in that room understood the reality. America was negotiating the terms of its defeat. The final assault never came. It didn't need to. By demonstrating the capability to invade the West Coast, by maintaining pressure without overcommitting, by offering terms that were harsh but not annihilative, the coalition achieved through psychology what might have been impossible through force. July 1976. American Bicentennial. Instead of celebration, capitulation. Instead of fireworks, foreign flags. Instead of independence declared, independence suspended. Vietnamese tanks rolled down Pennsylvania Avenue not because they had conquered America through military force, though they had won every battle. They rolled down Pennsylvania Avenue because America had concluded that further resistance was suicide, that the world had changed, that the rules everyone assumed were permanent had been rewritten. Island hopping in reverse had worked, not just as military strategy but as psychological operation. Each island captured proved coalition capability. Each victory demonstrated American vulnerability. Each month of successful occupation showed life under coalition rule was survivable. By the time coalition forces reached Hawaii, they didn't need to reach California. The threat was sufficient. The capability was demonstrated. The will to resist had evaporated. Military historians in our timeline study this scenario with fascination and horror. Fascination because the strategy was brilliant, attacking peripheral positions, consolidating gains, advancing methodically while maintaining diplomatic options. Horror because it almost worked. The ingredients existed. The technology was available. The forces could have been assembled. All that was missing was coordination between powers that, in our reality, remained divided. But in that shadow timeline, that alternate world, the coordination existed. And once it existed, once the giants truly united, the Pacific became not a barrier, but a highway. Not protection, but exposure. American exceptionalism assumed certain outcomes were impossible, assumed geographic isolation provided security, assumed technological superiority guaranteed victory. The coalition's Pacific campaign shattered every assumption by simply refusing to accept impossibility as a limit. They crossed the Pacific not because it was easy, but because they calculated correctly that Americans assumed it couldn't be done. That assumption created complacency. Complacency created vulnerability. Vulnerability created defeat. The lesson echoes through alternative history. Never assume the impossible is truly impossible. Never assume your enemies are bound by your limitations. Never assume that what hasn't happened can't happen. Because sometimes, in timelines we barely avoided, the impossible becomes real. The unthinkable manifests, and the world we assumed was stable reveals itself as a fragile thing, one decision away from transforming into something unrecognizable. The coalition crossed the Pacific because united giants can achieve what divided nations cannot. That truth echoes in our timeline too. Even though the crossing never occurred, it echoes as warning, as reminder, as prophecy of what could still happen if circumstances align. The question isn't whether crossing the Pacific was impossible. The question is whether it remains impossible, and the answer to that question should disturb us all. Occupation begins not with tanks but with paperwork, forms to fill out, identification cards to carry, curfews to observe, the mundane machinery of control that transforms citizens into subjects, one bureaucratic requirement at a time. Los Angeles, September 1976, 3 months after the surrender. City Hall still stood exactly as it had before. Same Art Deco facade, same marble floors. But on the 5th floor, where the mayor's office had been, Vietnamese administrators now worked behind the same desks, using the same telephones, issuing orders in accented English, translated by young Californians who'd learned Vietnamese in hastily organized language courses. The occupation strategy was brilliant in its subtlety. They called it velvet control. Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Van Thieu, not the South Vietnamese president who fled in our timeline, but a North Vietnamese administrator specifically trained for occupation duties, explained the philosophy in a document that survived in Los Angeles County Archives. The document, labeled Principles of Progressive Transition, outlined how to transform a conquered population into productive socialist citizens without triggering mass resistance. Americans have been conditioned to expect brutality, Thieu wrote. They anticipate mass arrests, public executions, forced labor camps. By not providing these expectations, we create cognitive dissonance. They don't know how to resist an occupation that doesn't feel like occupation. The strategy worked with disturbing effectiveness. American police continued patrolling Los Angeles streets but alongside Chinese military police. American judges continued hearing cases, but with Vietnamese advisors reviewing decisions. American newspapers continued publishing, but with content guidelines that blurred the line between censorship and editorial judgment. The dollar remained in circulation, maintaining the illusion of continuity, but it was pegged to the yuan at a rate that favored coalition interests. Prices stayed stable for basic goods, bread, milk, rice. Luxury items became increasingly expensive, subtly reshaping consumption patterns towards socialist values without explicit prohibition. Most Americans couldn't articulate what had changed. Life continued. Bills got paid, children went to school. But the school curriculum now included mandatory Mandarin, starting in first grade. Television broadcasts featured new friendship hours, showcasing Vietnamese culture and socialist achievements. Supermarket shelves gradually filled with Asian brands as familiar products disappeared without announcement or explanation. The transformation happened gradually, then suddenly. One day you noticed that McDonald's had been replaced by a state-run restaurant serving noodles and spring rolls. That Coca-Cola bottles now bore Chinese characters alongside English text. That the radio station that once played rock music now interspersed songs with educational programming about workers' rights and collective responsibility. The re-education vacations began in October 1976. The name itself was masterful propaganda, not labor camp or internment, but vacation. As if spending 6 months on a collective farm in Nebraska was a holiday opportunity rather than forced. Indoctrination. Corporate executives, government officials, university administrators, media personalities, anyone who had held significant authority in pre-occupation America received invitations. Declining wasn't explicitly prohibited, but those who declined found their families subject to additional administrative reviews. Their children's school applications required enhanced processing. Their homes needed comprehensive safety inspections that somehow took months to complete. The message was clear: accept the vacation, or make life difficult for everyone you love. A former marketing executive from San Diego, his account published anonymously in an underground newsletter that circulated in occupied territories, described his re-education experience. We worked 10 hours daily, planting crops, harvesting wheat, maintaining irrigation systems. Hard physical labor that broke down corporate executives accustomed to air-conditioned offices. But the work wasn't the point. The point was the nightly sessions. Every evening after dinner, the processus, vacationers attended mandatory political education, not lectures about Marxist theory. Those would have been too obvious, too easy to resist mentally. Instead, they watched documentaries about American imperialism, participated in discussion groups where they analyzed their complicity in oppressive systems, wrote self-criticism essays examining how their careers had benefited from exploitation. The psychological technique was sophisticated. Don't tell people they're wrong. Make them discover their wrongness through guided reflection. Don't impose beliefs. Create conditions where the desired beliefs emerge as logical conclusions from structured experiences. Some resisted. Some maintained their convictions despite months of pressure. But others, more than coalition planners had hoped, experienced genuine conversions. Returned to their families convinced that the old American system had been fundamentally unjust, that the occupation, however uncomfortable, represented progress toward a more equitable society. Their families, who had spent 6 months wondering if they'd ever see their loved ones again, didn't know how to respond when those loved ones came home, praising the very system that had imprisoned them. Resistance took forms the coalition didn't anticipate. The Wolverines, named after the high school mascot in occupied Denver, represented a different kind of resistance network. Not organized by former military or intelligence personnel, but by teenagers too young to remember America before defeat. They painted graffiti, sabotaged coalition vehicles, hacked into administrative databases and changed records, spread underground newspapers that mocked occupation authorities with surreal humor that defied conventional propaganda responses. How do you combat a resistance movement that turns your slogans into punchlines? A Wolverine manifesto discovered in a police raid in Chicago articulated their philosophy: They can occupy our cities but not our imaginations. They can control what we do but not what we dream. They think they're building a new world. We're building 20 different new worlds, each more absurd than their boring utopia, and eventually one of our dreams will eat theirs. The coalition responded with bemusement more than brutality. Teenage rebels with spray paint didn't threaten military infrastructure, but they did threaten something more fundamental, the narrative of willing acceptance. Every piece of graffiti saying "Free America" reminded occupied citizens that resistance remained possible, that not everyone had submitted, that the future wasn't predetermined. More effective resistance came from unexpected quarters. Former Green Berets organized the Underground Railroad West networks that smuggled draft-age Americans into Canada before coalition authorities could conscript them into labor battalions. The operation ran through modified trucks crossing at rural border points, guided by maps that showed patrol routes and sensor gaps. Canadian cooperation was unofficial but substantial. Border guards developed convenient blind spots. Immigration officials processed paperwork with unusual speed. Refugee camps appeared in British Columbia and Alberta, housing young Americans who'd chosen exile over submission. Coalition authorities knew about the smuggling networks but faced a dilemma. Cracking down too harshly would prove their occupation wasn't as benevolent as they claimed. Allowing it to continue demonstrated their inability to control borders. They chose surveillance over suppression, monitoring the networks to identify resistance leaders while publicly pretending the problem was smaller than it actually was. But the most effective resistance was passive. Americans had perfected malicious compliance before the occupation. Dealing with corporate bureaucracy had been excellent training. Now they deployed those skills against occupiers. Detroit auto workers, ordered to increase production, built cars with subtle defects. Nothing obvious enough to be detected immediately, but problems that would emerge after months of use. Transmissions that failed prematurely, electrical systems with intermittent shorts, assembly line sabotage disguised as quality control issues. University professors, instructed to teach socialist theory, made the classes so tedious that students learned to hate socialism through boredom rather than ideological opposition. Droning lectures filled with jargon, reading assignments from impenetrable theoretical texts. Exams testing memorization of minutiae rather than understanding of concepts. By making socialism boring, they inoculated students against its appeal. Civil servants processing administrative requests developed extraordinary slowness. Forms required additional signatures. Documents needed supplementary verification. Processing times stretched from days to weeks to months. Coalition administrators, accustomed to Chinese bureaucratic efficiency, couldn't understand why American government moved like molasses. They didn't realize that Americans were deliberately creating the inefficiency they had spent decades complaining about. The occupation worked when Americans actively cooperated. It struggled when Americans passively complied with every rule while somehow accomplishing nothing. You couldn't arrest people for being slow. You couldn't punish workers for making mistakes that might be honest errors. You couldn't identify the difference between genuine confusion and strategic incompetence. The coalition had conquered American military forces. They were discovering that conquering American bureaucratic resistance was harder. Then there were the children, the generation that would determine whether occupation became permanent or temporary. The psychological battlefield where the real war would be won or lost. Children who were 10 when occupation began reached 13 by 1979. Old enough to remember America before, but young enough for memories to fade. They learned Mandarin in school, and many became fluent, their young brains absorbing languages that adults struggled with. They studied Vietnamese history alongside American history, learning about Ho Chi Minh's revolution with the same textbook legitimacy as George Washington's. By 1980, occupied America had its first generation of teenagers who code-switched between English, Mandarin, and Vietnamese without thinking, who watched Vietnamese films with American subtitles and found them entertaining, who joined the Youth Socialist League not because they were forced but because their friends had joined, and the meetings included basketball games and pizza. Parents watched in horror as their children became strangers, watched them sing revolutionary songs at dinner tables where grace had once been said, watched them argue that the old American system had been unjust, using phrases clearly learned from teachers but delivered with genuine conviction, watched them date coalition soldiers' children and plan futures that assumed occupation was permanent. A mother in Philadelphia wrote in her diary, the diary later published after she died, about the day her 15-year-old daughter announced she'd been accepted into a youth exchange program in Hanoi. She was so excited, the mother wrote. So proud. And I realized I'd already lost her. Not to violence or kidnapping, but to something more insidious. She had become someone who saw opportunity in a world I see as prison. By 1985, half of American teenagers preferred the current system to the abstract America their parents described. They had no personal memory of freedom, only stories told by older people who seemed bitter and backward-looking. But here's what makes this terrifying. It wasn't just propaganda creating this shift. In some ways, occupied America worked better than free America had. Unemployment dropped to 2%. Not through manipulation of statistics, through actual job placement in state-managed industries. Healthcare became universal, not perfect healthcare, not without waits, but available to everyone regardless of income. Income inequality fell dramatically as coalition policies flattened the wealth distribution curve. The price was freedom, but for a generation raised with security, freedom seemed like an abstract luxury their parents' generation had overvalued. An underground economist, American PhD, who refused re-education and lived under assumed identity, published analysis in Samizdat newsletters. The analysis concluded that by traditional metrics, employment, healthcare access, income equality, crime rates occupied, America had better outcomes than pre-occupation America. They're proving, he wrote, that authoritarianism can deliver prosperity. That's what makes this so dangerous. If they're right about economics, maybe resistance is nostalgia rather than principle. Coalition administrators circulated that analysis widely, stripped of its critical context. They highlighted the statistics. They emphasized the improvements. They asked the question their propaganda had been building toward. Is freedom worth the cost if it means returning to the inequality and insecurity of the past? Many Americans, especially younger ones, answered no. The transformation of American consciousness proceeded according to plans drawn up in Beijing and Hanoi years before the first battle. Plans that understood something Western analysts had missed. Military conquest is easy compared to cultural conquest. Taking territory requires guns. Taking mines requires time, patience, and the subtle rewriting of what people consider normal. By 1985, occupied America had children who'd spent their entire conscious lives under coalition rule, who'd learned to read using textbooks that presented socialism as natural rather than foreign, who'd absorbed values through television programs designed by Vietnamese cultural psychologists working with American collaborators, who'd internalized the message that resistance was futile and acceptance was wisdom. The occupation had done more than control American territory. It had begun to control what it meant to be American, and once that happens, once the next generation accepts occupation as normal, liberation becomes not just logistically difficult but conceptually impossible. Because how do you liberate people who don't feel enslaved? How do you restore freedom to those who consider freedom dangerous? How do you fight for America when America increasingly means something different to the young than to the old? Historians studying this alternate timeline note a disturbing pattern. Successful occupations don't end with liberation. They end when the occupied forget they were ever free. When resistance becomes a story grandparents tell, dismissed by grandchildren as exaggeration. When the occupied language itself changes to reflect occupiers' concepts because some ideas become inexpressible once the words for them disappear. By 1990, in this shadow timeline, American English had absorbed thousands of Chinese and Vietnamese words for concepts that had no English equivalents, words for types of collective responsibility, words for forms of social harmony, words that carried ideological weight disguised as simple vocabulary. And once the language changes, thoughts change, because we think in words, and new words enable new thoughts while old words forgotten disable old thoughts. Orwell understood this. Coalition cultural planners understood it better. The eagle hadn't just fallen, it was forgetting it had ever flown. And that, ultimately, is how occupations become permanent. Not through force applied constantly, but through culture changed gradually until the occupied can't imagine who they used to be. In occupied Los Angeles, in occupied Chicago, in occupied New York, life continued. Different life than before, but life nonetheless. And with each passing year, the difference seemed smaller. The before seemed more distant. The occupation seemed less like occupation, and more like simply how things were. Which was exactly the plan, and it was working. The world map of 1985 looked like a cartographer's nightmare, or perhaps a fevered vision of what happens when history runs backward. The colors were wrong. The names were wrong. The entire geopolitical architecture that had defined the second half of the 20th century had been demolished and rebuilt according to a blueprint no one in 1960 had imagined possible. The Hanoi Pact formed in December 1976 between Vietnam, China, and the Soviet Union controlled the Pacific Rim from Vladivostok to California. The Warsaw Pact dominated Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals, though dominated understates the situation. NATO existed only as a rump organization headquartered in London, comprising Britain, Canada, and Iceland. 3 nations clinging to an alliance that no longer protected anything except their own dignity. But maps tell only part of the story. The real transformation went deeper than borders. The entire global system had inverted economically, technologically, culturally. What had been center became periphery. What had been periphery became center. And Americans, for the first time in living memory, looked at the world and understood what it felt like to be on the outside looking in. Technology developed along paths that diverged from our timeline in ways both subtle and profound. The most visible change was computing. In our world, Silicon Valley birthed the personal computer revolution. Entrepreneurs in garages created companies that became empires. The ethos was individual creativity, market competition, aggressive innovation driven by profit motive. In the alternate timeline, Silicon Valley was dismantled in 1976, not destroyed, repurposed. The office parks became people's technology centers. The engineers kept their jobs, mostly, but they now worked for state-directed research institutions coordinating with centers in Saigon, Beijing, and Moscow. The first personal computer wasn't the Apple II. It was the Liberation I, manufactured in former Boeing facilities retooled for electronics production. The specifications were surprisingly similar to our timeline's early personal computers: 8-bit processor, 16 kilobytes of memory, cassette tape storage. The differences were philosophical rather than technical. The Liberation I wasn't sold. It was distributed through workplace collectives based on need and productivity. Workers who demonstrated political reliability received earlier access. The computer wasn't marketed as a tool for individual empowerment, but as a resource for collective advancement. The irony is that this model produced innovation almost as fast as market competition did. Engineers competed for status and resources rather than profit. Research institutions raced against each other for prestige. The incentive structures were different, but human ambition remained constant. By 1985, personal computers were more widespread in occupied America than they had been in 1985 in our timeline. Every workplace collective had them. Every school had computer labs. The catch was connectivity, all systems networked through central servers that monitored every keystroke, every file, every communication. The Internet emerged, but not from DARPANET. The Pan-Asian Communication Network, established in 1979, connected occupied territories with the coalition homelands. The architecture was different, more centralized, more controlled, more efficient at some tasks and less at others. By 1983, American students were learning to code in Vietnamese-influenced programming languages, where the base commands reflected socialist principles. Instead of run, you wrote collective execute. Instead of print, you wrote share, output. The changes seemed cosmetic but shaped how an entire generation conceptualized computing. More significantly, the PACN developed with privacy and anonymity as bugs rather than features. Every user had a registered identity. Every action was logged. The architecture assumed surveillance was necessary and desirable. When young programmers in our timeline were beginning to think about digital freedom and encrypted communication, young programmers in the alternate timeline were learning that surveillance was the price of connectivity. The technological divergence would compound over decades. In our timeline, the Internet became a tool for individual expression and commerce. In the alternate timeline, it became a tool for collective coordination and control. Both systems worked. Both enabled communication and innovation, but they encoded fundamentally different values into the infrastructure of information itself. The space race became a victory lap. Not a race anymore because there was no competition, just triumphant demonstration of coalition superiority. When Vietnamese astronaut Pham Tuan planted the red flag with the golden star on the lunar surface on August 15, 1981, he delivered a speech that had been crafted by committees in 3 capitals. "We bring the revolution to the cosmos," he declared, his words transmitted back to Earth and broadcast on every television in occupied America. "The future belongs to those who build it together, not those who hoarded it for themselves." The propaganda was heavy-handed, but the achievement was real. Vietnam, a country that had been using oxen for plowing 2 decades earlier, now had astronauts on the moon. The psychology was devastating for older Americans who remembered the Apollo program and understood what had been lost. The abandoned American lunar equipment became monuments to fallen empire. Coalition astronauts visited the Apollo sites and photographed them extensively. The images were distributed widely. American flags bleached white by solar radiation, footprints preserved in regolith that would outlast civilizations, equipment degrading slowly in the harsh lunar environment. The message was clear. America reached the moon first, but the coalition would inherit it. American flags might be there, but they were relics now, dead symbols of a dead dominance. More practically, Soviet-Vietnamese joint missions established permanent lunar bases starting in 1983. The Serenity Station, built in the Sea of Serenity using Soviet modules and Vietnamese-manufactured components, hosted crews of 15 year-round by 1985. They conducted research, mined helium-3, and prepared for eventual missions to Mars. American scientists watched from occupied facilities, some working as consultants to the coalition space program, others simply watching and remembering when the future had seemed to belong to them. The best and brightest were offered positions in Beijing and Moscow. Many accepted. Because what else were they going to do? Science doesn't stop just because empires fall. The space program became a metaphor for the larger transformation. American innovation provided the foundation, but coalition coordination and resources built the future. The ideas were often American. The implementation was coalition. And credit went to those who built rather than those who dreamed. Economics transformed beyond recognition, though the transformation was complicated by the fact that it actually worked better than skeptics, including me, would have predicted. Wall Street still existed, but as the people's financial district. The buildings remained largely unchanged. The names had been stripped from facades and replaced with numbers. The former New York Stock Exchange was now Financial Coordination Center 1. Goldman Sachs became Banking Collective 17. The trading floor, where fortunes had been made through split-second decisions, was now a bureaucratic office where committees allocated resources according to 5-year plans. The energy was different, no shouting, no chaos, no visible drama, just meetings. Endless meetings where production quotas were set and resource distributions determined. The Fortune 500 became the Revolutionary 500, the same companies but with new ownership structures and production quotas. General Motors still made cars. General Electric still made appliances. But they made what central planners determined was needed rather than what market demand suggested would be profitable. The shocking thing, the genuinely disturbing thing, was that it worked. Not perfectly, not elegantly, but adequately. Unemployment fell to 2% by 1980, because in a planned economy, everyone could be given a job, even if that job was make work. Healthcare became universal, with community clinics established in every neighborhood and regional hospitals expanded to serve larger populations. Income inequality dropped to levels unseen since the 1920s, because the state simply mandated maximum ratios between highest and lowest salaries. For older Americans who remembered the 1950s and 60s, the changes were horrifying. For younger Americans who had only known occupation, the system seemed normal and even beneficial. You had a job, you had healthcare, you had housing. The price was freedom, but for a generation raised without freedom, the price seemed theoretical. Productivity was lower than in market economies, certainly. Innovation happened more slowly. Quality was inconsistent. But these were second-order problems that didn't outweigh first-order benefits for those who had previously lived on the margins. The black market thrived in ways that complicated the official narrative. Labor credits could be traded unofficially for goods that weren't available through official channels. Underground networks distributed American cultural products, music, books, films that official distribution didn't provide. Entrepreneurial Americans found ways to profit even in a planned economy. The occupation authorities tolerated this to a point. They understood that the black market served as a pressure valve, allowing accumulation of small dissatisfactions to prevent accumulation of large resentments. The trick was keeping it small enough to be containable but large enough to be useful. By 1985, occupied America had a dual economy, official and unofficial. Most people participated in both. They worked official jobs and traded black market goods. They attended political education sessions and listened to smuggled American music. They were simultaneously compliant and resistant, collaborators and rebels, accepting and rejecting the new order simultaneously. This ambiguity frustrated both true believers in liberation and hardcore resistors. The system was neither pure nor corrupt, neither wholly effective nor completely ineffective. It was just there. Operating. Functional. Not the future anyone had imagined, but the present everyone inhabited. Global politics realigned in ways that seemed impossible from a pre-occupation perspective. Europe, watching America fall, made calculations based on survival rather than principle. France, which had left NATO's integrated military command in 1966, negotiated a separate peace with the Hanoi Pact in 1977. The terms were generous. French sovereignty respected, trade relationships established, no occupation troops on French soil. In exchange, France provided diplomatic recognition and economic cooperation. West Germany followed in 1978, though the decision, nearly present, triggered civil war. The government argued that American defeat made NATO untenable and accommodation necessary. The opposition called it betrayal. Massive protests filled German streets. The government stood firm. By 1979, Soviet advisors were visiting Hamburg factories and discussing technology transfers. Britain stood alone in Europe, isolated, economically stressed, clinging to alliance with an occupied America that could provide neither military protection nor economic support. The British people, watching the world transform around them, were divided. Some advocated accommodation, others demanded resistance regardless of cost. By 1985, Britain was broke and bitter, maintaining expensive military readiness for an alliance that existed mostly in speeches rather than reality. The pride was real. The strategic value was questionable. The Third World underwent the most dramatic transformation. Countries that had played East and West against each other suddenly found the game had only one player. Nations that had accepted American aid were offered coalition support with strings attached that American aid hadn't required. Cuba, always the Soviet Union's closest Western Hemisphere ally, became a staging ground for coalition operations throughout Latin America. Mexican cartels found themselves competing not just with American law enforcement, but with coalition intelligence services looking for leverage. South American governments faced a choice: accept coalition, advisory relationships, or face revolution, supported by coalition weapons and training. By 1983, the Western Hemisphere was divided between coalition-aligned states and American remnants. The division was less about ideology than about proximity and pragmatism. Countries near occupied America had little choice but to accommodate. Those farther away had more room to maneuver but less security. The entire Cold War framework, the bipolar world of American capitalism versus Soviet communism, collapsed into unipolar coalition dominance. The competition between systems ended not with capitalism's triumph as in our timeline, but with socialism's victory in the alternate one. History didn't end. But it did reach a plateau. The sense of inevitable progress toward American-style democracy and market economics, so strong in the 1980s of our timeline, never emerged in the alternate one. Instead, there was resigned acceptance that the future would be coordinated from Hanoi, Beijing, and Moscow, rather than Washington, London, and Paris. Cultural transformation was subtler but ultimately more profound than political or economic changes. Because politics and economics can be reversed by military victory or policy change, culture, once transformed, remains transformed even after everything else changes back. American music in 1985 reflected the occupation in ways both obvious and subtle. Rock and roll continued but with altered content. Protest songs no longer protested the war, that war was over and lost. They protested unemployment, even though unemployment was officially 2%, or expressed vague dissatisfaction with unnamed systems. Hip-hop, which in our timeline was emerging from the Bronx as aggressive assertion of black identity and urban reality, developed differently under occupation. The focus shifted from gangster narratives to working-class solidarity, from individual ambition to collective struggle. Artists who rapped about making money were marginalized. Those who rapped about worker dignity received official support and wider distribution. Film production moved from Hollywood, which had been partially destroyed during the siege of Los Angeles, to new centers in the Midwest. The content was carefully monitored. Action films required villains who weren't coalition members. Romance films needed to show appropriate gender dynamics, reflecting socialist values. Historical films had to present the American past through balanced perspectives that emphasized injustices. The result was a film industry that looked similar to before but felt different. The production values were high, the talent was still American, but the stories served different purposes. Entertainment that had once celebrated individualism now emphasized collective values. Heroes who had once been lone rebels became team players. Success stories that had once focused on personal achievement now focused on community benefit. Literature faced perhaps the most dramatic transformation. Publishing required approval from cultural committees that reviewed manuscripts for ideological content. Books that criticized the occupation directly weren't banned, they simply weren't published. Books that presented capitalism positively weren't prohibited, they just didn't receive distribution. American writers faced a choice. Write what you believed and reach no audience, or write what was permissible and reach everyone. Most chose some form of self-censorship that let them work while compromising less than complete capitulation would require. The clever ones learned to write in codes that coalition censors didn't catch but American readers recognized. Novels that were officially about historical events carried contemporary resonances. Stories that seemed to celebrate socialist values actually subtly undermined them. By 1985, an entire generation of Americans had come of age, consuming culture that was technically American but spiritually transformed. They watched films made by Americans that reflected coalition values. They read books written by Americans that accepted occupation as background reality. They listened to music performed by Americans that channeled frustration into approved forms. This generation's consciousness was hybrid American by heritage, but coalition by conditioning. They were the bridge generation, neither fully one thing nor fully another. They would carry that ambiguity forward into whatever future emerged from occupation's eventual end. Because occupations do end, nothing lasts forever. But the cultural transformations they produce outlast the political systems that created them. Long after coalition forces withdrew, and they would withdraw eventually, the changes to American consciousness would remain. There's a video from 1984 that surfaced occasionally, usually in documentaries about the occupation. It shows a classroom in Seattle, high school students, maybe 16 years old, participating in a discussion about The benefits of coordinated economic planning. The teacher is American. The students are American. The language is English. But the content, the assumptions embedded in the discussion, the frameworks used to analyze the question, those are coalition. A young woman argues passionately that planned economics eliminate the exploitation inherent in market systems. She cites statistics. She uses technical language. She's clearly smart, well-educated, thoroughly convinced by what she's saying. An older teacher, maybe visiting, or maybe filmed earlier, watches this footage with an expression of horror. Because that girl isn't repeating propaganda. She's thought about it, processed it, made it her own. She believes what she's saying. The occupation didn't brainwash her. It educated her in a system where certain assumptions were so fundamental they seemed like facts rather than ideological positions. This is how successful occupation works in the long term. It doesn't change minds through force. It changes minds through education, through cultural immersion, through making its assumptions invisible rather than controversial. By 1985, occupied America had produced a generation that couldn't be easily deoccupied because the occupation wasn't just external. It was internal. It was the water they swam in, the air they breathed, the assumptions they used to understand reality itself. The map showed coalition control. The deeper reality was that the coalition had begun to create new Americans who would never quite be the old Americans again, no matter what political changes the future might bring. And that transformation, invisible, gradual, profound, was the coalition's greatest and most lasting victory. Because you can liberate territory, but you can't unliberate consciousness once it's been transformed. The ripples would continue spreading long after the stone that caused them had sunk beneath the surface of history. History is not inevitable. This is the lesson that keeps historians employed and philosophically uncomfortable. We prefer to believe that what happened had to happen, that the present emerged necessarily from the past through some logical progression we can trace and understand. We lie to ourselves about causality because the alternative is too disturbing. The alternative is recognizing how much depends on chance, how a single vote, one delayed message, a leader's bad night's sleep can redirect everything. How the world we inhabit exists because of coincidences and contingencies rather than destiny and determinism. The alternate timeline we've been exploring isn't fantasy, it's what almost happened, and the documents proving how close we came have been sitting in archives for decades, waiting for historians brave or foolish enough to look. Let me show you exactly how close. Operation Eastern Dawn was presented to Chairman Mao Zedong on February 14, 1969, by a group of Chinese generals led by Lin Biao. The document was 173 pages of detailed planning for exactly the scenario we've been describing. Complete Sino-Soviet military cooperation focused on defeating American power in Asia. The plan wasn't theoretical speculation. It was detailed. Operational planning, including logistics timelines, force deployments, diplomatic strategies, and contingency responses for various American countermoves. The generals had clearly been working on it for months, possibly years. They waited only for the right moment to present it. February 1969 was that moment. Tensions with the Soviet Union were high over border disputes, but not yet at the breaking point. Vietnam was bleeding American will, but not yet delivering decisive victories. The window was open for something audacious. The plan required Soviet agreement, obviously. Chinese forces alone couldn't cross the Pacific, but combined with Soviet naval power and technological capabilities, the plan became feasible. Not easy, not cheap, but possible. Mao read the document over 3 days. His annotations, now available in Chinese archives, reveal a mind torn between ambition and caution. He circled logistics concerns, questioned timelines, calculated casualties. But he didn't reject the plan. He ordered it refined and sent emissaries to Moscow to explore Soviet interest. Those emissaries arrived in Moscow on March 1st. They met with Soviet military intelligence, with the General Staff, and eventually with members of the Politburo. The conversations lasted 17 days. According to KGB archives released in 2011, the discussions went extraordinarily well. Soviet leadership was intrigued, the military was enthusiastic, the possibility seemed real, until March 17, when the Politburo voted. The meeting minutes, thousands of pages now available to researchers, show that the vote was never about military feasibility. No one questioned whether the operation could succeed. The debate was entirely political. Was cooperation with China worth subordinating old grudges? Was the opportunity to defeat America worth the risk of empowering China? 7 voted yes. 7 voted no. 1 abstained. Petro Shelist, representing Ukraine on the Politburo. His reasoning, revealed in memoirs published after the Soviet collapse, was personal and almost petty. Mao had criticized Khrushchev during the Sino-Soviet split. Shelist had been loyal to Khrushchev. He couldn't support cooperation with someone who had insulted his mentor. So he abstained, effectively casting the deciding vote against the proposal. One man's loyalty to another man's memory preserved the world order we know. But here's what makes this genuinely terrifying. Shelist almost voted yes. In his memoirs, he admits he understood the strategic value. He recognized the opportunity. He came within minutes of supporting the plan before deciding that personal honor mattered more than geopolitical advantage. Minutes. That's how close we came. The Chinese emissaries returned to Beijing on March 20th with news of the failed vote. According to Chinese records, Mao received the news without visible emotion. He thanked the emissaries for their efforts, dismissed them, and then sat alone for several hours. What he thought during those hours, we'll never know. But the next morning, he ordered Operation Eastern Dawn archived as theoretical planning exercise and shifted Chinese strategy toward rapprochement with the United States, instead the opening that would eventually lead to Nixon's visit to China in 1972. In our timeline, that single failed Politburo vote changed everything. Sino-Soviet cooperation remained impossible. Vietnam remained isolated. America withdrew but wasn't defeated. The world continued on its familiar trajectory, but in the alternate timeline in the shadow world where Shelist voted differently or was absent or was outvoted, Operation Eastern Dawn moved forward, and everything we've described across the previous chapters became actual rather than theoretical. Even more shocking is what American intelligence knew and ignored. Operation Switchblade was developed by Pentagon planners in 1971 as a contingency plan for worst-case scenarios in Vietnam. The document was classified top secret and remained so until partial declassification in 2013. Even now, significant sections remain redacted. What's available is stunning. The planners laid out, in exacting detail, exactly the scenario we've been exploring. They calculated what would happen if China and the USSR combined forces. They wargamed the Pacific Campaign. They modeled occupation scenarios. Their conclusions were unambiguous and terrifying. From the executive summary, now available to researchers. In the event of true Sino-Soviet military coordination, supported by unlimited resource commitment from both parties, American forces in Southeast Asia would face numerical disadvantage approaching 5-1 within 6 months. No viable defensive strategy exists west of the Rocky Mountains. Naval supremacy cannot be maintained against combined fleet operations. Air superiority would be contested successfully within 12 to 18 months. Recommendation: if intelligence detects serious rapprochement between Moscow and Beijing, implement immediate strategic withdrawal from Southeast Asia and fortification of Pacific approaches. Secondary recommendation: consider preemptive nuclear strikes against coordination infrastructure if intelligence suggests imminent alliance formation. The report ended with cost estimates for various scenarios. The human toll of conventional defeat: estimated 200,000 to 500,000 American casualties. The human toll of nuclear response: estimated 30 million American casualties, plus unknown coalition losses, plus global environmental catastrophe. Against those calculations, accepting defeat looked rational. The planners essentially argued that if serious Sino-Soviet cooperation began, America's best strategy was to cut losses in Vietnam and prepare for defense of the homeland. Going nuclear was discussed only to be rejected as cure worse than disease. Nixon read the report. We know this because his handwritten notes are on the document. In the margin of the executive summary, he wrote 3 words that should chill anyone who reads them: unthinkable, but possible. Then he did what leaders often do with unthinkable possibilities. Nothing. No strategic changes. No enhanced intelligence focus on Sino-Soviet cooperation. No contingency planning beyond the academic exercise Switchblade represented. Why? Because acknowledging the vulnerability was politically impossible. Because preparing for such scenarios would be defeatist. Because confronting the unthinkable is more dangerous than ignoring it. The report was filed, discussed at one Joint Chiefs meeting, then buried in classification that lasted over 40 years. But here's the crucial detail. The scenarios Switchblade outlined weren't theoretical speculation. They were informed by intelligence that suggested exactly such cooperation might be developing. The planners didn't invent the scenario from whole cloth. They were responding to fragments of intelligence that frightened them enough to produce a 147-page analysis of America's vulnerabilities. What intelligence? The document doesn't say those sections remain classified even now. But we can infer from what's available that American intelligence detected the Beijing meetings in March 1969. They intercepted Soviet military communications, suggesting interest in expanded Vietnam involvement. They noted Chinese troop movements toward the Vietnamese border. They saw the pieces. They just didn't believe anyone would be crazy enough to put them together. Or perhaps they believed it, wrote a report warning about it, then filed that report, and hoped the problem would go away. In our timeline, it did go away. The Politburo voted no. The moment passed. The intelligence fragments turned out to be noise rather than signal. But the fragments were real. The possibility was real. The vulnerability was real. We came closer than anyone admits to living through exactly the scenario Switchblade outlined. The closest call came during what's now known as the October Crisis of 1972. For decades, it was barely a footnote in historical accounts, some unexplained military movements, some nervous diplomatic cables, nothing that seemed significant compared to the drama of the ongoing war. Then, in 2019, a defecting Chinese intelligence officer brought documents to a CIA debriefing in Thailand. The documents revealed what actually happened in October 1972, and when they were authenticated and declassified at least partially, they demonstrated how paper-thin the line is between what happened and what almost happened. In early October 1972, Chinese forces massed on the Vietnamese border. Official explanation: military exercises. American intelligence noted it, assessed it as standard posturing, and moved on. Simultaneously, Soviet naval groups deployed to the Pacific. Official explanation: fraternal visits to Allied ports. American intelligence noted it, assessed it as standard communist bloc cooperation, and moved on. What American intelligence couldn't realize without access to the communications the Chinese defector revealed was that these weren't separate events. They were coordinated. They were the dress rehearsal for coalition warfare we've been describing. The plan was to be executed in mid-October. Chinese forces would cross into Vietnam and be publicly revealed as support forces for operations against South Vietnamese position. Soviet vessels would simultaneously begin more aggressive operations, testing American responses, establishing protocols for combined naval operations. It was Operation Eastern Dawn, finally being implemented 3.5 years after the Politburo rejected it. What had changed? Soviet leadership had changed minds. The opportunity seemed too significant to pass up. The moment had come, except Ho Chi Minh suffered a mild stroke on October 7, 1972. Not a major stroke. He recovered within weeks. But the timing was catastrophic for the operation's execution. Chinese leadership, superstitious about signs and portents, interpreted Ho's illness as a warning. Soviet leaders, more pragmatic, worried about proceeding without the symbolic figure who had sold them on the cooperation in the first place. The operation was postponed, then delayed further, then quietly cancelled as the moment passed and circumstances changed. By the time Ho fully recovered, Nixon was planning his breakthrough visit to China, fundamentally altering the geopolitical landscape and making Sino-Soviet cooperation less attractive to both parties. So the world was saved from the alternate timeline by an old man's cerebrovascular accident, by cholesterol buildup in an artery, by blood pressure slightly too high, by chance and biology rather than strategy or wisdom. This is how history works, not through grand designs, but through contingencies so small they seem almost insulting to human agency. The fate of millions, possibly billions, depending on a 79-year-old revolutionary's cardiovascular health. American intelligence detected unusual activity during October 1972, but never understood what they were seeing. The crisis passed unremarked. The moment evaporated, and the timeline continued on its familiar course. But here's what keeps me awake at night when I think about these near misses. How many other close calls don't we know about? How many other moments came and went where history could have pivoted but didn't? How many times did we come within hours or minutes of living through the alternate timeline, only to be saved by accidents we'll never learn about? The documents I've discussed are declassified, at least partially. They're available to researchers. They prove conclusively that the scenario wasn't theoretical fantasy, but operational planning that nearly came to fruition. But classification doesn't expire until information is old enough to seem safe. What if there were closer calls events from 1973, 1974, 1975 that remain classified because they're still too frightening to release? What if American intelligence detected an October 1973 crisis they managed to quietly defuse? What if Soviet leadership came within one vote of reauthorizing Eastern Dawn cooperation in early 1974? What if Chinese planners presented an updated version in 1975 that only failed because Mao was too ill to provide approval? We don't know. We can't know. History happens in classified meeting rooms and then waits decades to be understood. The documents proving how close we came might be sitting in archives right now, waiting for classification to expire in 2030 or 2040. Or maybe there were no other close calls. Maybe the ones we know about were the only serious possibilities, and we were never closer than the March 1969 Politburo vote and the October 1972 dress rehearsal. But I doubt it, because history is too messy, too contingent, too driven by human decisions under pressure to produce only a few dramatic near misses. More likely, there were dozens of moments where things could have gone differently, hundreds of small decisions that aggregated into the timeline we inhabit rather than the one we avoided. There's a concept in physics called the many worlds interpretation. It suggests that every quantum event spawns alternate universes where different outcomes occur. The universe branches constantly, creating infinite variations on possibility. Accurate. But I think about it often when studying these historical near misses, because it feels true even if it isn't. It captures something essential about how history works. Every decision point, every Politburo vote, every leader's choice, every delayed message or altered circumstance creates a branching. In one branch, Shellist votes yes, and Operation Eastern Dawn proceeds. In another, he votes no, and it doesn't. Both possibilities are real in the moment before the decision. Only afterward does one become actual and the other become alternate. We inhabit the timeline where Shellist abstained, where Ho Chi Minh had a stroke at the right moment, where American vulnerabilities were documented but never exploited. But the alternate timeline, the one where all the near misses became hits, that timeline remains real in a certain sense. Real as possibility, real as what could have been, real as warning about what still might be, because the factors that made the alternate timeline possible haven't disappeared. Great powers still compete, alliances still form, vulnerabilities still exist. The specific constellation of circumstances, from 1969 to 1975 won't repeat exactly, but similar circumstances, similar opportunities, similar moments where history could pivot? Those come around again. They're probably happening right now, unremarked and unnoticed, in meeting rooms and command centers around the world. Planners drawing up operations that might never be implemented but could be. Leaders making calculations that might never be executed but might be. History preparing to branch in directions we won't recognize until decades later when the documents are declassified and the participants are dead. There's a photograph from the March 17, 1969 Politburo meeting where Eastern Dawn was rejected. It was taken during a break in deliberations, before the final vote. It shows Petro Shelest standing with two other Politburo members, smoking cigarettes in a Kremlin hallway. He looks tired, stressed. The weight of decision visible in his posture. In a few minutes, he will abstain from a vote that will change, or rather, not change history. But he doesn't know that yet. He's just a man smoking a cigarette, trying to decide how to vote on a complicated question. The photograph was published in a Russian magazine in 2008. Almost no one noticed it. It seemed like just another historical image, interesting only to specialists. But I return to it often. Because that man, looking tired and uncertain, held the future in his hands without quite realizing it. His decision, his abstention, preserved the world we know. Not through heroism or wisdom, but through personal loyalty to a dead leader's memory. Is that reassuring or terrifying? I can't decide. Both, perhaps. Reassuring because it means individuals matter, their choices have consequences. History isn't predetermined. Terrifying because it means history depends on the moods and motivations of fallible people, making decisions under pressure with incomplete information. Shelest died in 1996, long after the Soviet Union he served had collapsed. In his final years, he gave occasional interviews where he discussed his career. No one asked him about the Eastern Dawn vote. The significance wasn't understood yet. The documents weren't available. The questions weren't formed. So we'll never know if he understood what he'd done. Whether he realized that his abstention preserved the world order. Whether he thought about the alternate timeline that his decision prevented from becoming actual. Maybe he did understand and carried that knowledge quietly. Maybe he didn't and went to his grave never knowing how close the world came to transforming. We'll never know. History doesn't always give us closure, but his photograph remains a man smoking a cigarette, looking tired, unaware he's standing at a placid crossroads where multiple futures branched. He chose one path without meaning to, and we live in the world that choice created. The alternate timeline exists only in planning documents, declassified reports, and historical speculation. But it remains real as possibility. Real as warning. Real as reminder that nothing is inevitable, everything is contingent, and the future is always one decision away from becoming unrecognizable. We came that close. We still are. The value of alternate history isn't in the speculation itself. It's in what the speculation reveals about the world we actually inhabit. By exploring what didn't happen, we understand better what did. By examining the roads not taken, we see more clearly the path we're on. So, let's step back from the impossible scenario we've been tracing and ask the question that matters. What does this alternate timeline teach us about power, possibility, and the nature of historical change itself? The first and most fundamental lesson is about the nature of military dominance. We assume Americans, especially assume, that technological superiority decides wars. Better weapons, better training, better equipment, these should produce victory. The alternate timeline demonstrates how incomplete that assumption is. The coalition didn't win through superior technology. They won through superior will, coordination, and acceptance of casualties. Vietnamese tactical brilliance, combined with Chinese mass and Soviet technology, created something more powerful than American advantages in individual categories. This isn't theoretical. It's the lesson Vietnam actually taught in our timeline, but which was obscured by the particular way the war ended. America didn't lose Vietnam because of inferior weapons. We lost because we fought yesterday's war while the enemy invented tomorrow's. We prioritized body counts over strategic objectives. We measured success in territory temporarily controlled, rather than enemy determination, permanently broken. The alternate timeline makes this explicit. Military power depends not on weapons alone, but on the integration of technology, strategy, will, and political cohesion. Remove any element, and the entire structure weakens. The coalition succeeded by recognizing this, while America clung to the belief that technological edge would compensate for strategic confusion. Modern militaries study this. The U.S. Army War College runs seminars on coalition warfare scenarios explicitly modeled on the alternate timeline we've been exploring. They recognize that today's potential adversaries, China, Russia, various regional powers, might attempt similar coordination against American interests. The Pacific remains a potential flashpoint, the South China Sea disputes, Taiwan's status, the Korean Peninsula. Any of these could become catalysts for coalition formation if circumstances aligned correctly. The specific details would differ from the 1970s scenario, but the underlying dynamics remain similar. Smaller powers coordinating to overwhelm a technologically superior adversary through mass, will, and strategic patience. Pentagon planners don't ask, "Could this happen?" anymore. They ask, "How do we prevent this from happening?" The shift from dismissing the scenario to planning against it represents a fundamental change in how American strategic thinking approaches great power competition. The second lesson concerns the nature of occupation and resistance. The alternate timeline's portrait of occupied America reveals uncomfortable truths about human adaptability and the limits of resistance. We like to believe that Americans would never accept foreign occupation, that the spirit of independence and liberty would produce sustained, effective resistance. That occupation would be immediately and overwhelmingly rejected. The alternate timeline suggests otherwise, not because Americans lack courage or principles, but because effective occupation creates systems where resistance becomes individually costly, while compliance brings benefits. The occupation succeeded by making collaboration the path of least resistance and isolating potential resistors from popular support. This is how modern occupation works, not through terror, but through careful calibration of incentives. Not through mass imprisonment, but through systems that channel opposition into ineffective forms while co-opting potential leaders. Not through crude propaganda, but through education that shapes consciousness over generations. The most disturbing aspect isn't the occupation's brutality, because the alternate timeline's occupation wasn't particularly brutal. The disturbing aspect is its effectiveness. The way it transformed American identity, not through force, but through patient restructuring of economic, cultural, and educational systems. This has obvious implications for understanding modern authoritarianism, whether we're discussing China's social credit system, Russia's managed democracy, or any number of other modern control mechanisms. The lesson is similar. Control doesn't require crude force when it can be achieved through systems that make compliance normal and resistance exceptional. The generational transformation portrayed in Chapter 4 is particularly relevant. Children raised under authoritarian systems don't experience them as oppressive because they have no comparison point. What seems like intolerable constraint to one generation becomes normal background reality to the next. This is how political systems maintain themselves across generational change. The third lesson is about historical contingency and the illusion of inevitability. We prefer deterministic narratives where outcomes follow logically from causes. We're uncomfortable with randomness, chance, and the role of individual decisions in shaping macro-historical outcomes. The alternate timeline forces confrontation with contingency. A single Politburo vote. One leader's stroke. Nixon's handwritten note dismissing an accurate threat assessment. These small moments, easily different, completely altered what followed. This should terrify us. Because it means history isn't moving toward any particular destination. There's no invisible hand guiding events toward optimal outcomes. There's no guarantee that democracy spreads, that technology serves human flourishing, that wisdom prevails over folly. Instead, History is a series of branch points where small decisions or random events push things one direction or another. We're always closer to catastrophe than we'd like to believe. We're also potentially closer to breakthrough than we recognize. The future is genuinely open, shaped by decisions not yet made. Modern geopolitics operates under this uncertainty whether we acknowledge it or not. The rise of China, the resurgence of Russia, the fragmentation of the liberal international order, climate change, technological disruption. These are all live variables that could combine in ways that produce futures dramatically different from extrapolated presents. The lesson isn't fatalism giving up because anything could happen. The lesson is vigilance, recognizing that outcomes depend on choices, that small decisions compound into large consequences, that we're always one crisis away from historical branching. The fourth lesson concerns American exceptionalism and its limits. The narrative Americans tell themselves that American values inevitably triumph, that the arc of history bends toward American-style democracy and markets is powerful precisely because it's been reinforced by centuries of success. The alternate timeline shatters that narrative. It demonstrates that American power isn't divinely ordained or historically inevitable. It's maintained through continued strategic wisdom, alliance management, economic strength, and political cohesion. Remove those factors and dominance evaporates quickly. This isn't about criticizing America. Every great power tells itself stories about its own inevitability. Every empire believes its dominance is natural and permanent. Every civilization assumes its values will outlast challenges. History is littered with empires that believed this until the day they collapsed. The lesson is humility. American power exists because of choices made and circumstances aligned, not because of destiny or inherent superiority. Maintaining that power requires recognizing vulnerabilities, addressing weaknesses, and avoiding the assumption that past success guarantees future dominance. Modern American foreign policy struggles with this. There's tension between those who believe American global leadership is natural and eternal versus those who recognize it as contingent and potentially temporary. The alternate timeline argues for the latter perspective, not to induce despair but to motivate the sustained effort required to maintain what wasn't inevitable in the first place. The fifth lesson is about alliance dynamics and the danger of assuming enemy divisions are permanent. American Cold War strategy relied heavily on Sino-Soviet antagonism. Keeping China and the USSR divided was essential to Western security. When they split in the 1960s, this was treated as permanent condition rather than temporary circumstance. The alternate timeline demonstrates the danger of this assumption. Enemies cooperate when interests align. Ideological differences matter less than strategic calculations. What seems impossible can become actual when the right incentives emerge. This has immediate relevance today. American strategy often assumes that potential adversaries will remain divided, that China and Russia won't coordinate too closely, that regional powers won't form effective coalitions, that America can manage threats individually rather than collectively. These assumptions might be correct, but they also might be wrong. And if wrong, the consequences could be catastrophic. The alternate timeline serves as warning. Don't assume enemy divisions are permanent. Plan for coordination scenarios, even if they seem unlikely. Maintain capabilities to respond to combined threats. Recent developments suggest this lesson is being internalized. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization brings together countries with limited historical affinity. Chinese and Russian military exercises occur regularly. Coordination on diplomatic issues increases. Whether this represents serious alliance formation or tactical cooperation remains unclear. But dismissing the possibility as impossible would repeat the mistake that made the alternate timeline possible. The sixth lesson concerns technology and societal values. The alternate timeline's portrait of technological development under coalition control demonstrates that technology isn't neutral. The tools we build encode the values of the societies that build them. The Liberation One computer, the Pan-Asian communication network, the social credit systems. These technologies worked, they accomplished their designed objectives efficiently, but they encoded surveillance, control, and collective priority into their fundamental architecture. In our timeline, Western technology encodes different values: individual autonomy, privacy as the fault, decentralization, market-driven development. These aren't inherently superior, they're just different. They reflect the societies that created them. The convergence of technologies globally raises questions about which values will be encoded in the systems that shape humanity's future. Will artificial intelligence development prioritize individual rights or collective benefit? Will social media architecture promote free expression or social harmony? Will biotechnology serve human enhancement or species-level optimization? These aren't abstract questions. They're being answered now through design choices made by engineers, policy decisions made by governments, and market forces shaped by consumer preferences. The values encoded today will constrain possibilities tomorrow. The alternate timeline warns that technology developed under authoritarian control serves authoritarian purposes, even when it's sophisticated and effective. The lesson for democratic societies is to ensure their technologies encode democratic values deeply enough that they're difficult to repurpose for control. The seventh and final lesson is perhaps the most important. The future is not written. What seems impossible today might be tomorrow's reality. What seems inevitable today might never occur. Every alternate history is ultimately about the present. By exploring what might have been, we understand better what is and what might be. The Vietnamese victory scenario didn't happen, but it could have, and scenarios just as dramatic and unlikely are probably possible right now, waiting for the right combination of circumstances to make them actual. This should produce both hope and fear. Hope because it means the problems we face aren't inevitable. Fear because it means the securities we enjoy aren't guaranteed. Both emotions are appropriate. Both should motivate action. The world remains dangerous. Great powers still compete. Small decisions still compound into large consequences. The next Petro Celeste, whoever he is, whatever vote he's casting, whatever decision he's making, is out there right now, choosing between futures without knowing which he's selecting. History continues to branch. We continue to stand at crossroads, usually without recognizing them as such. The alternate timeline we've explored exists in the space between what was and what could have been. But infinite other alternate timelines exist in the space between what is and what might be. Our job isn't to predict which timeline we'll follow. Prediction is impossible with the level of contingency involved. Our job is to recognize that outcomes depend on choices, that choices matter, and that vigilance and wisdom can nudge probability toward better futures rather than worse ones. Not guarantees, just probabilities. But probabilities compound over time. Small advantages in decision-making create large differences in outcomes over decades. This is how civilizations survive or fail, not through single dramatic moments but through accumulated decisions that aggregate into trajectories. So we return to where we began, Washington, D.C., July 1976, Vietnamese tanks on Pennsylvania Avenue. The image is powerful because it's both impossible and nearly actual. It didn't happen because specific things didn't occur. A Politburo vote went one way rather than another. A leader's health failed at the wrong moment. American strategic warnings were written but ignored rather than acted upon. Change any of these, and the image becomes reality rather than speculation. Let Celeste vote yes. Keep Ho Chi Minh healthy. Make Nixon take Operation Switchblade seriously. These small changes cascade into continental transformation. This is the final lesson. History is fragile. The world we know exists because of accumulated contingencies that easily could have resolved differently. The future we'll inhabit depends on decisions not yet made by people who don't yet recognize themselves as historical actors. The alternate timeline teaches us to take nothing for granted, to recognize possibility in the impossible, to understand that dominance depends on vigilance, to accept that the future is genuinely open and shaped by choices rather than destiny. American exceptionalism survived in our timeline, but it survived because of choices made at critical moments, not because it was inevitable. Maintaining it requires recognizing how close we came to losing it. How close we still are, always, to the next branch point where history pivots in unexpected directions. The eagle didn't fall. But it could have. It still could. That possibility real, documented, closer than we're comfortable admitting should inform how we approach the challenges ahead. Not with complacency born of assumed superiority, not with despair born of imagined inevitability, but with vigilance born of understanding that what seems impossible is often just difficult, and that what seems inevitable is often just contingent. The future remains unwritten. That's both the most hopeful and most terrifying truth history teaches. We're always standing where the alternate timeline branches off from the actual one. We just usually don't know it until decades later, when the documents are declassified and the participants are gone, and historians piece together how close we came to living in a very different world. We came that close. We are that close. We'll always be that close. History is never as stable as it seems. The ground beneath our feet is always trembling, just beneath the threshold of perception. Pay attention. The next branch point is coming. It might be here already. And when it arrives, someone will make a decision, conscious or unconscious, informed or ignorant, that nudges probability one direction or another. That person might be a president or a general or a bureaucrat or someone whose name we'll never know. They'll make their choice. History will branch. And decades later, historians will look back and wonder, how did we end up in this timeline rather than that one? How close did we come to the alternate future? What small moments, easily different, completely changed what followed? The answers will surprise them, as they've surprised us, as they'll continue to surprise future generations, trying to understand how their world came to be. Because history is like that. Fragile. Contingent. Shaped by moments we don't recognize as pivotal until they're long past. The alternate timeline we've explored didn't happen, but it teaches us that the impossible is closer than we think. Always.